Good evening, and welcome to another new episode of Seaden presents Spookinory. This ghostly tale is titled The Midnight Orchestra. The Cumbernauld Theatre had served the local populace for the last 150 years. Originally, only aristocrats and the very rich would frequent the venue. Then it went into a state of disrepair during the First World War, and only a few people would enter. A few tried in a bid to find shelter, only to leave in a hurry after only a few nights. No one asked questions and no one really cared until the outbreak of the Second World War. During 1939, scores of workmen appeared at the theatre with tools in hand. The big double doors would swing open and the men would enter. After a few weeks, rumours of mysterious things were happening inside were rife amongst the community. Most rumours were from a local cafe owner named Reg. At lunch times, most of the workmen would come into the cafe for lunch, and Reg would never resist eavesdropping on the conversations. He was eager to find out what they were doing inside the theatre. The majority of the workmen's chatter was about things being moved or hidden, strange noises, and every now and then some of the men claimed they had seen a lady walking around between the orchestra pit and the dressing rooms. After 3 weeks, the workmen stopped coming and the big double doors were closed, locked and chained up. September the 2nd and the chains were removed again. September the 3rd, Neville Chamberlain declared war on Germany and suddenly the theatre sprung back into life. It reopens as a general entertainment venue for civilians and the military, and Christmas 1941 saw the American troops arrive. Stationed nearby, they would come into the town and relax and unwind in the evenings. The Cumbernauld would become the venue of choice. Local businesses boomed and Reg was in his element yet again. People would come into the cafe and Reg would again eavesdrop on the conversations. Things were still happening inside the theatre. After many years, the theatre remained a hive of activity. Its use would change from time to time, but it always remained open. For the last few years it changed from a bar to meeting rooms, with all the original features remaining inside. 15 staff manned the theatre, including the caretaker who lived on the premises. Peter, the caretaker, would open the doors in the morning for the staff and then head to the cafe for his breakfast. He would spend a good 2 hours inside chatting to Reg, who was now retired. Reg's son, John, now carried on with the business. Most of the conversations were about the mundane, everyday things in life. 9 times out of 10, the conversation would always end with Reg asking if there was anything to report in the theatre. Peter would always be able to recall tales of anything that happened the night before. He had learned to deal with everything that happened after the doors had closed for the night. It didn't bother him too much. He would ensure that the doors were locked and everything was in its place before retiring to his apartment for the night. Reg was happy to tell his tales of the war years and events that happened there, and Peter would be able to confirm these incidences as they were still happening. Reg's son would listen in eagerly, taking mental notes and writing them down as soon as Peter had left the cafe and returned to work. He had a small shelf out the back which contained small notebooks full of scribbled notes which his father had originally started, with the aim of writing them out in full at a later date. He never seemed to find the time. John vowed to continue his father's work and hopefully write out the contents of 60+ notebooks. At times, when the cafe had closed for the evening, John would sit back in his office and read through some of the first notebooks to refresh his memory on the history of the place. His father's handwriting was hard to read, and John would have to read entire sections a couple of times over before he could understand what was written. After a few months, he could see a clear pattern was forming. Most of the sightings and strange goings-on were all coming from the areas of the orchestra pit and the dressing rooms. After a few weeks had gone by, one lunchtime, Peter ran into the cafe, calling for John. "You must get your dad out of here." He grabbed John's arm and dragged him into the office. He landed in the office chair and spun around. What are you talking about, Peter? You know my dad has never been away from here. Peter perched himself on the table edge, placed a hand on John's shoulder. You must, for your dad's sake, Peter cried. A sense of urgency was ringing through John's head. John sat firmly in his chair, opened a drawer and drew a bottle of Jack Daniels out, his favourite. He poured a glass for himself and Peter sat back, caressing his glass. John had never seen Peter take a drink that fast, or anyone else for that matter. You know what's been happening there. You have them books with all the details in. You must get him away. John was shocked. Peter knew about the notebooks. I have read them books over and over, and I only know a fraction of what's going on in there. Peter grabbed the bottle and poured himself a generous serving of Jack Daniels. As you know, I have heard things in there, things we don't really understand. Yes. Right, there is a woman in there, among others, but this woman's is the one I hear the most. John finished his glass and started to pour another. Your family name is Walker, yes? Yes, but what has that got to do with anything? John started to get a little angry. Early this morning, I was disturbed by the sound of music in the theatre, down by the orchestra pit. So I went to check it out. I opened the back stall's door and stepped inside. John laughed. I hope you brought a ticket. This is serious, Peter shouted back. I must have stood there for the best part of an hour, until the music stopped. I heard the instrument cases closing. Then I heard voices. It was a group of people talking, but there was one lady's voice that was the strongest and the loudest of them all. John raised an intrigued eyebrow. What was she saying? This is where I freaked out, and Peter downed his second glass and began to reach for the bottle. John put his hand over the top of the bottle and pulled it away. Tell me, and then you can have another. She was talking to the others. She was saying that it was a good rehearsal and that once the full orchestra was there, it would be even better. So what does this have to do with my father? John replied. Everything. She mentioned your dad by name, he cried out. What? She mentioned my father? Yes. She said soon Reg Walker will be with us. His space is ready. John gave Peter the bottle and got out of his chair and walked over to the shelf containing the notebooks. On the shelf was a myriad of books, all of different colours, the spines all dated mainly with month and year. Some were specifically dated by weeks. John assumed that a lot of the things that had happened in that particular week were pretty frequent. He pointed along the shelf and ran his hand along and then stopped. Here it is, grabbed a notebook. He sat back down and rifled through the pages, and after a minute he stopped. There. He turned the book around and slid towards Peter and pointed to the page. Tuesday, the 8th of August, 1939. Read it. Peter picked up the notebook and started reading. Oh my God, Peter cried. This happened. I thought this was just a ghost story. Obviously not, John replied, and he picked up the book and reread the pages. Listening to a couple of workmen today. They were the first inside the theatre this morning. They claimed to have heard music coming from down inside the orchestra pit, and they went to check it out to find nothing there. They probably thought they were hearing things, but then apparently they heard the dressing room door slam shut, which is always kept closed. When they approached the door, they could hear voices coming from inside, so they stopped and listened. They could hear a lady's voice saying that the orchestra wasn't complete, but eventually new members would arrive. Someone by the name of Chloe seemed to be the head of the group. She said that the man by the name of Matthew Messenger would be joining them soon. Peter looked up. Matthew Messenger? He was one of the workmen that worked on the theatre before the war started. Really? John replied. It reminded him of something, and he returned to the shelf, grabbed another book, sat down and began flicking through the pages again. Here. He handed it to Peter. He began to read. Sad day for the guys today. Work has stopped. Thought it was due to the war, but I was wrong. One of the guys, Matthew something, then the word something had been scribbled out and replaced with Messenger. was killed in an accident today. A beam collapsed onto him near the dressing rooms, and no one could get to him in time. Poor chap." "Shit!" Peter cried out and placed the book down. "The name was mentioned, and a couple of weeks later he was dead," Peter replied. "Surely that's enough to get your father out of here." John looked directly at Peter. "My father doesn't have any connection with the theatre, though." "Of course he does. He served everyone from that place up until now. He watched people come and go and formed close ties with them. There's the connection. Plus he has been inside the theatre plenty of times. I've seen him sitting in the stalls." Reg was always a regular visitor to the theatre over the years. He had fallen in love with the place, so when he had the time free, he would enter and go and sit at the back and watch the stage. John knew that his father would visit the place, but never realised how often. John took yet another drink. He did like the place, but never knew how much. "There must be something else in these books that we've missed," Peter said, started browsing through the other notebooks. John joined him, taking book after book off the shelves and flicking through the pages. After some time, all the books were on the desk. All the ones that had a reference to John's father were placed, page open, to one side of the desk. "Some are missing," said John. "How do you mean?" "We always put the books in date order, but there are some gaps in order of them." John started searching through the other shelves, then looking in the cupboards and drawers. In the corner of the office laid a small chest. Reg had told John that it contained the old decorations from the cafe inside. Peter walked over to the chest. "What's in here?" "Just old stuff from the cafe," John replied. "Can't harm to have a look," and he opened the lid. Upon opening, Peter was confronted with a musty smell of old cloth. "This is an old stage curtain," Peter called out, pulling the cloth out of the chest and holding it up in front of John. "He must have taken it from the theatre." John's eyes shot wide open and pointed at the chest. "There is the missing books," and he ran over to the chest, grabbed the books and placed them on the desk. John picked up a book with the newest date on the spine and started reading through it. Peter started with the oldest of them. "Holy shit," John cried out. "I never knew." "Never knew what?" Peter asked. "My dad didn't just love the place, he also loved someone that worked in there. It's here, look," and he handed Peter the book. "Wow," Peter replied in shock. Written clearly inside, Reg had put, "Cannot wait to return and see Chloe again." "So he knows who Chloe is?" Peter asked. "Definitely." After some time going through the remaining books, John put the last one down, emptied the remaining drink into 2 glasses. "I think I know what's happening here. It's that every time someone who dies that is connected to the theatre in any way, they end up being a part of the orchestra." "So where is your dad connected to the theatre?" Peter asked. "I think he fell in love with the stories to start with. Then he started to look into it himself. He then got more and more involved, and that made him a part of the theatre. He goes on a lot about this Chloe. She was the head of the orchestra," John interrupted. Peter's eyebrows lifted. "He goes on a lot about her in the books. I think that's why he hid the books away, so that your mother wouldn't find them." A look of puzzlement shot through John's face. He took his phone out of his pocket and started looking through the browser. "What are you looking for?" Peter asked. "I'm looking for some info on the orchestra," he replied. "You reckon you'll find anything on her?" "I have it here now. It says she was the head of the orchestra for 25 years until her untimely death. They categorised her as the greatest band leader of all time, and that'll explain why she's still there. Dad fell in love with the stories, and after a while he's fallen in love with her. Now she has mentioned him. Where is your dad now?" "Shit. He said he was going for a walk. Bet I know where we'll find him." Peter and John went running out of the office and through the cafe, knocking a waitress, sending her spinning out of control with a stack of dirty crockery in her hands, and she crash-landed into a side table, sending plates and cutlery all over the floor. They shot through the door and out onto the street, towards the theatre. They reached the theatre doors and stopped to catch their breath. Peter panted. "Are you sure he'll be in here?" "Yes, he's got to be," John replied, and they both walked up the steps to the entrance. Peter whispered, "Quietly, we don't want to disturb anything or anyone." They opened the door and slowly crept inside. They paused just inside the foyer. "Can you hear it? They're playing," said Peter, turning to face it and mesmerised John. "So it's true. I never really believed it 100%, John replied. They slowly made their way to the entrance of the rear seating area. All the time the music was playing, the sounds echoing off the walls. They reached the doors and gently pushed them open, just far enough for them to creep inside. John motioned to Peter by placing his forefinger to his lips to signal him to be quiet. In the dim light of the theatre, John could just make out the silhouette of his father sitting in the stalls. With the music still playing, he slowly made his way down to the row his father was sitting in. He slowly slid along the row of seats until he got to his father's side and sat down beside him. In the meantime, Peter had taken his phone out of his pocket and started to record everything on the video camera. All that time, the music played on. "Are you all right, Dad?" John asked. Suddenly, the music stopped. John turned to face Peter. Peter just shrugged his shoulders. Then came the sound of closing instrument cases. Peter started to make his way down to the orchestra pit. "Dad," John said a little louder. He placed his hand on Reggie's. It was cold as ice. John knew his dad had gone. A sole tear welled up in his eye and rolled down his cheek. "Peter, he's gone," John called out. Peter, by this time, almost was directly on top of the orchestra pit. John got up and quickly made his way down to join Peter. There was a huge bang as the dressing room door is thrust shut. It made them jump and turn quickly to face the area of the dressing rooms. They ran to the doorway. Peter signalled to John to stop, and they both placed an ear to the dressing room door. What came next shocked Peter. It mostly upset John. Through the door, they could hear people talking. There was no way to isolate the voices. Then suddenly silence. Then a lady's voice could be heard. It was that of Chloe. "Our orchestra is complete. I would like to welcome our latest and last member, Reg." Until next time, good night.